You're driving through the night, miles from civilization, when something impossible steps into your headlights. Your mind tells you it can't be real, but your hands are already shaking on the wheel. For the 11 truckers you're about to hear from, that moment of disbelief became the beginning of something they'll never forget. These are the people who drive America's darkest roads, who see what happens in the hours when most of us are safely asleep. The screaming started at mile marker 47, somewhere deep in the Haynesville woods where Route 2A cuts through Maine like a scar. And I knew immediately that something was wrong, because no human voice should carry that far in a blizzard. I'd been driving for 16 hours straight, hauling refrigerated goods from Portland to Houlton, and the snow had been coming down so hard that my headlights barely cut through 10 feet of white chaos. But that scream pierced through the roar of my diesel engine and the howling wind like it was coming from inside my cab. I gripped the wheel tighter, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a fox or a coyote. Because that's what you tell yourself when you're alone on a road that's claimed more lives than anyone wants to count. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read -8 degrees, and I'd passed the last gas station 20 miles back, which meant there was no way anyone could survive out there in the woods. Especially not in the thin coat and dress I thought I saw for just a second in my peripheral vision. I kept driving because that's what you do when you've got a deadline and a mortgage, and a boss who doesn't care about ghost stories. But the screaming followed me to mile marker 48, then 49, then 50. Always at the same distance. Always with that same desperate, pleading quality that made my stomach turn and my hands shake. I tried turning up the radio to drown it out, but the static was so thick that nothing came through except occasional bursts of something that might have been words or might have been just my imagination playing tricks in the white noise. At mile marker 52, I saw her again, this time clearly in my headlights for just a fraction of a second. A woman in a summer dress, bare arms, bare legs, standing on the shoulder of the road with her mouth open in a scream I could hear despite being inside a sealed truck cab moving at 40 miles per hour. I slammed on the brakes without thinking, and my rig fishtailed on the ice, the trailer swinging wide behind me as I fought to keep control, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. When I finally got the truck stopped, I sat there with the engine idling, my breath fogging up the windshield, staring at the spot where she'd been standing. But there was nothing there except unbroken snow and the dark wall of pine trees that pressed in from both sides of the road. I should have driven away right then. Should have put my foot on the gas and not looked back. But something made me grab my flashlight and open the door. And the moment I stepped out into that screaming wind, I heard her voice coming from 3 different directions at once. The snow was falling so thick I could barely see my own truck, and my boots sank into powder up to my shins as I stumbled toward the tree line, shouting into the darkness, asking if anyone was there, if anyone needed help. The screaming got louder, closer, and I could hear words, "Now, help me," and "please," and "I'm so cold." But they echoed wrong, like they were bouncing off walls that didn't exist. And when I shined my flashlight into the trees, I saw footprints in the snow that couldn't have been more than a few seconds old. Small barefoot prints that led deeper into the woods in a perfectly straight line. I followed them because I'm an idiot who watches too many horror movies and still somehow thinks he can be the hero. And the footprints led me about 50 yards into the forest before they just stopped, not faded or covered by new snow, but stopped like whoever made them had simply ceased to exist mid-step. That's when I noticed the silence. The screaming had cut off completely, and even the wind had died down to nothing. And I was standing in a circle of trees where the snow on the ground was completely undisturbed, except for my own tracks, those impossible barefoot prints that ended at nothing. I turned around slowly, sweeping my flashlight across the darkness, and that's when I saw her standing behind me, not 10 feet away. And she was smiling now instead of screaming, and her eyes were completely black, no whites, no pupils, just endless dark that seemed to pull at something inside my chest. She opened her mouth like she was going to speak, and I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I turned and ran through that snow like my life depended on it, because some part of my brain that's older and smarter than my conscious mind knew that I was in danger. Real danger, the kind that doesn't care about logic or explanations. I could hear her following me, hear footsteps that were too light and too fast to be human. And the screaming started again, but now it was coming from my own mouth as I crashed through the trees, branches whipping my face, snow filling my boots, my lungs burning from the cold and the fear. I made it back to my truck and threw myself inside, slamming the door and locking it with shaking hands. And I didn't look back as I put the rig in gear and accelerated as fast as the ice would allow, fishtailing onto the highway and pushing the speedometer up to 60 despite the conditions. The screaming followed me for another 12 miles, getting fainter and fainter until it finally faded somewhere around mile marker 64. And by the time I reached the northern edge of Haynesville woods, the sun was starting to come up and the snow had stopped and everything looked normal again, like the last hour had been some kind of fever dream. I stopped at a truck stop in Danforth and asked the guy at the counter if he knew anything about the stretch of Route 2A through Haynesville. And he looked at me for a long moment before asking if I'd heard the screaming woman. When I nodded, he just shook his head and told me I was the 5th driver this winter to come in asking about her, and that nobody knows who she is or what she wants. But everyone who follows her into those woods either doesn't come back or comes back, changed. And he could see in my eyes that I was one of the changed ones. I finished my coffee in silence, paid, and got back on the road. And I've driven Route 2A probably a dozen times since then. Always during the day, never at night, never in the snow. Because I know she's still out there in those woods, waiting for the next driver who's stupid enough or tired enough or desperate enough to stop when they hear that impossible scream cutting through the winter darkness. If you're ever driving through Maine in the winter and you hear a woman screaming somewhere around mile marker 47, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Don't look. Don't stop. Don't try to help. Because whatever's out there in the Haynesville woods, it's not human anymore. And it doesn't want your help. It wants something else. Something I don't have words for. But I can still feel sometimes when I close my eyes and remember those black, endless eyes staring at me in the flashlight beam. I didn't believe in the Devil's Highway until I saw the red semi in my mirror doing 90 on a road where 80 would get you killed. And that's when I realized some legends exist, because they're the only way to explain what can't be explained. It was August of 1998, back when Highway 666 still had that cursed number before they changed it to US 491. Trying to scrub away decades of stories about the road that cuts through New Mexico's high desert, like God dragged his fingernail through the earth and forgot to heal the wound. I was 24. Cocky as hell, hauling electronics from Albuquerque to Cortez. And I'd heard all the truck stop stories about phantom riders and devil dogs and mysterious hitchhikers who vanished from locked cabs. But I figured it was just old-timers trying to scare young drivers like me who thought we knew everything. The sun was setting behind me, turning the desert into this blood-orange nightmare. And the highway stretched out ahead like a black ribbon through nothing, just scrub brush and red rock and emptiness that made you feel like you'd driven off the edge of civilization into some forgotten corner of the world where normal rules didn't apply. I noticed the truck around mile marker 34, which I only remember because that's where the old gas station used to be before it burned down in the 70s. killing everyone inside in a fire that witnesses said burned blue instead of orange. He was behind me, maybe half a mile back. And the first thing I noticed was the color. Bright cherry red, so vivid it almost seemed to glow in my mirrors, like someone had painted a semi with fresh blood. I didn't think much of it at first, because plenty of owner-operators customize their rigs, trying to stand out, trying to make a statement. But something about the way it moved bothered me. The way it seemed to glide over the road, without the usual bounce and sway you get from 18 wheels on pavement that's been baked and frozen and baked again until it's more patched than original asphalt. I sped up a little, testing, because that's what you do when another truck is riding your tail. You either slow down to let them pass, or you speed up to create distance. And slowing down has never been my style. I pushed my speedometer from 70 to 75, watching my mirrors, and the red rig matched my speed exactly, maintaining that same half-mile distance like we were connected by an invisible rope. 75 to 80. And still he matched me. And now I could feel my pulse starting to quicken because something was wrong. Something fundamental that my brain couldn't quite process, but my body understood on an instinctual level. I grabbed my CB radio and called out, asking if there was a red Peterbilt on Highway 6 northbound around mile marker 40. And I got nothing back except static and what might have been laughter, distorted and wrong, like someone was laughing underwater. The sun dropped below the horizon, and suddenly the desert was dark, that absolute darkness you only get in places where there's no light pollution, no towns, no other cars, just you and the road and whatever's following you. I watched my mirrors, and the red truck's headlights were wrong. They should have been white or yellow like every other vehicle on Earth. But these were red too. Deep crimson that reminded me of animal eyes reflecting light. And they were getting closer even though my speedometer said I was doing 85 on a road posted for 65. My hands were sweating on the wheel, and I kept telling myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe it was an optical illusion caused by desert heat rising off the pavement. Maybe my mirrors were playing tricks. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But then I saw him pass me on the left, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was seeing something that shouldn't exist. He went by doing what must have been 100 miles an hour, and the rig was massive, bigger than any semi I'd ever seen, with a trailer that seemed to stretch back forever into the darkness. And when I looked up at the cab as it passed, the driver's window was dark, not tinted but empty, like looking into a well that has no bottom. The whole truck was pristine, not a scratch or a dent or a speck of dirt, which is impossible for any working rig, and there was no company name, no dot number, no license plate, nothing to identify it except that blood-red paint that seemed to drink the light from my headlights instead of reflecting it. He pulled in front of me, and I watched his taillights, red as hot coals, unblinking, perfect circles that looked more like eyes than lights. And then he accelerated away, vanishing into the darkness ahead so fast it was like he'd simply ceased to exist. I should have felt relief. But instead, I felt this creeping dread because something told me it wasn't over. And sure enough, 5 miles later, there he was again in my mirrors. That same half-mile distance, those same red headlights, like he'd looped back around, or teleported, or had never actually left at all. This happened 7 more times over the next 100 miles. He'd pass me at impossible speed, disappear into the night, then reappear behind me like we were trapped in some kind of loop, some cosmic game I didn't understand and couldn't escape. Each time he passed, I tried to get a better look at the cab, tried to see who or what was driving, but the windows were always dark, always empty. And once I could have sworn I saw something moving in there. Something that was definitely not human. all angles and shadows that bent in ways that hurt my eyes to look at. Around mile marker 120, somewhere near the Colorado border, he passed me one last time, but instead of disappearing ahead, he slowed down, matching my speed exactly, running parallel to me in the left lane with maybe 3 feet between our trailers, and I could feel the heat coming off his rig even through my closed windows, feel it like standing too close to a furnace, smell something burning that wasn't rubber or diesel, but something organic and wrong, like meat left in the sun too long. I couldn't help myself. I looked over at his cab, really looked. And what I saw in that driver's seat wasn't a person, wasn't anything I have words for. But it turned its head toward me. And I saw eyes that were too large and too many. And they saw me. Really saw me. Saw through me to something underneath my skin. And it smiled with too many teeth in a mouth that opened too wide. I slammed on my brakes without thinking, locked up my wheels, sent my trailer into a jackknife that almost rolled me, felt the anti-lock brakes screaming as I fought for control, and the red truck just kept going, steady speed, perfect control. Those tail lights getting smaller and smaller until they winked out somewhere near the state line. And I was alone on that dark highway, with my heart trying to punch through my ribs and my hands shaking so bad I had to pull over and sit there for 20 minutes before I could trust myself to drive. A state trooper found me on the shoulder about an hour later, asked if I was okay, if I needed help. And when I asked him if he'd seen a red semi-truck, he got this look on his face, this mixture of sympathy and something else, something like recognition. And he told me I was the 3rd driver this month to report the phantom rig, and that as far as anyone could tell, it had been haunting Highway 666 since before it was even paved, back when it was just a dirt track through the desert that the Navajo refused to travel after dark. I finished my run to Cortez, delivered my load, and I never drove Highway 66 again, not even after they changed the number, because some places are cursed by what they are, not what they're called. And some things can't be explained away with new paint and new signs and new numbers on a map. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through darkness, I catch a glimpse of red in my mirrors. Just for a second, just long enough to make my breath catch and my foot ease off the gas. But it always turns out to be just taillights. Just another truck. Just my imagination playing tricks. At least that's what I tell myself. But I know better. I know that thing is still out there on that desert highway, still running its endless route through the darkness, still looking for drivers who don't believe in devils and demons and roads that lead to places no map can show. The thing about driving the same route for 15 years is that you start to crave company, any company, even a stranger's voice to break up the monotony of white lines and reflector posts, which is why I stopped for the girl with the backpack on Interstate 40 outside Memphis, and why I'll never pick up another hitchhiker as long as I live. She was standing under the glow of a rest area light, thumb out, wearing jeans and a university hoodie, looking exactly like someone's daughter or sister or girlfriend who'd had car trouble or missed a bus. Nothing threatening, nothing unusual. Just another kid trying to get somewhere in a world that stopped being kind to people who travel on trust and hope. I pulled over because I remembered being young and broke and stranded, because my daughter was about the same age and I'd want someone to help her if she needed it. And because after 14 hours alone in a cab, I was desperate for another human voice, even if it was just for an hour or two. She climbed in with a smile and a "thank you so much," settling into the passenger seat like she belonged there, putting her backpack at her feet, buckling her seatbelt with a click that sounded real and solid and normal. Her name was Sarah, or at least that's what she told me. And she said she was heading east to Nashville for a music internship, that her car had broken down 2 days ago, and she'd been trying to get rides ever since. And she spoke with this easy confidence that made me relax, made me forget all the warnings about picking up strangers, all the horror stories truckers tell each other about the wrong people getting into cabs. We talked about everything and nothing. Her dreams of working in the music industry, my years on the road, her favorite bands, my daughter's college plans, the state of the world, the best truck stops for coffee. Normal conversation between two people sharing a journey. And I remember thinking how nice it was to have someone to talk to. How the miles seemed shorter with company, how her laugh was genuine when I told a stupid joke about a truck driver and a priest. Around the 100-mile mark, somewhere in the dark stretch between rest stops where the highway cuts through farmland that hasn't changed since the Civil War, I offered her some coffee from my thermos, and she said yes, and I reached back to grab it from the cup holder behind my seat. And when I looked over to hand it to her, she was staring straight ahead with this expression I can't quite describe. Like she was seeing something through the windshield that wasn't there. Something distant and terrible. And her face had gone completely slack, empty, like someone had unplugged whatever makes a person present and alive. I asked if she was okay, and she didn't respond, just kept staring, and I said her name. Sarah, louder this time. And she turned to look at me with eyes that were wrong, the pupils too large, taking up almost the entire iris. And when she spoke, her voice was different. Lower, older, like someone else was using her mouth. She said, "Do you know what it's like to be forgotten?" And I didn't know how to answer that. Didn't understand what she was asking or why her voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away, somewhere hollow and echoing. She said, "I've been waiting at that rest stop for 16 years, and you're the 43rd person to pick me up, and none of you remember afterward. None of you ever remember." And I felt this cold weight settle in my stomach because nothing she was saying made sense. But it felt true in a way that made my hands tighten on the wheel. I tried to laugh it off, tried to say she was just tired, that we'd both been on the road too long, that maybe she should try to get some sleep. But she reached over and touched my arm, and her hand was so cold it burned, cold like touching dry ice. And I jerked away so hard I almost swerved into the other lane. She pulled her hand back and looked at it like she'd forgotten she had hands, and she said, "I'm sorry. I forget sometimes that I'm supposed to feel warm, supposed to feel real. But it's been so long since I was alive that I can't quite remember how it works anymore." I wanted to pull over, wanted to stop the truck and make her get out. But something kept my foot on the gas, something deeper than fear or logic. And she kept talking in that hollow voice about the accident in 2009, about the semi that crossed the center line and hit her car head-on, about how she woke up standing under the rest area light with a backpack she didn't remember packing and no memory of what came after the impact, about how drivers keep stopping for her and she keeps having the same conversations and arriving nowhere. I looked over at her backpack at her feet, really looked at it. And I could see now that it was wrong, the colors too faded, the style from a decade ago. And there was something dark on one corner that might have been a stain or might have been blood. And when I looked back at her face, I could see it too, the wrongness. The way her features seemed slightly blurred around the edges like a photograph left in the sun too long. Like she was a copy of a person, degrading a little more with each iteration. She told me about the other drivers, about the conversations she'd had 42 times before, always slightly different but fundamentally the same, about how some of them screamed when they realized, how some of them cried, how some of them just went quiet and drove faster, trying to outrun the truth of what was sitting next to them. I asked her what she wanted, why she kept doing this, and she said she didn't know anymore. That maybe she was trying to get to Nashville, trying to finish the journey that was interrupted. Or maybe she was just trapped in the last moment she understood, the last decision she made, the last time she felt like she had control over her own destiny. Endlessly repeated because there's nothing else for her to do in whatever space she occupies now. The mile markers kept sliding past, 180, 185, 190. And she started to fade. Not disappear, but become less solid, more transparent, like watching someone slowly dissolve into the air. And she said this always happens around the 2-hour mark, that she can never maintain the connection longer than that. That soon I'd forget we ever had this conversation, and tomorrow I'd probably pick her up again if I came back this way. I wanted to tell her I'd remember, wanted to prove her wrong. But even as I thought it, I could feel the memory starting to slip, starting to blur at the edges like trying to hold on to a dream after waking. And I looked over at the passenger seat just as we passed mile marker 195. And she was gone, completely gone. Not even a depression in the seat cushion or warmth where she'd been sitting, just empty space and the faint smell of something like rain and copper. I pulled over at the next rest stop, my hands shaking, my breath coming too fast, and I grabbed my logbook to write down everything that had happened, every detail, every word. Because she said none of the other drivers remembered, and I was determined to be different. But when I put pen to paper, my mind went blank, the memories scattering like smoke, and all I could write was picked up hitchhiker, and then nothing. Just emptiness where the story should be. I called my wife, tried to tell her something strange had happened, but I couldn't explain what, couldn't form the words, and she asked if I was okay, if I needed to come home, if I'd been driving too long without rest. I stayed at that rest stop for 3 hours, drinking coffee, pacing, trying to reconstruct what happened in the missing time between picking someone up and finding myself alone. And I couldn't. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't remember her face or her name or anything we talked about. Just this overwhelming sense that I'd lost something important, something I needed to hold on to. I looked at the passenger seat and noticed something I'd missed. A single long hair on the headrest, dark brown. And when I touched it, it disintegrated into dust, into nothing, into proof that vanished the moment I tried to confirm it was real. I drove the rest of the way to Nashville in silence. No radio, no CB, just me and the road. And this growing certainty that something fundamental had changed, that I'd crossed some invisible line between the world I understood and a world where the rules were different, where the dead could hitch rides and the living couldn't remember afterward. I delivered my load the next morning, exhausted, confused, checking my passenger seat every few minutes to make sure it was still empty. And when I came back through that same stretch of I-40 2 days later, I saw her again in the rest area light, thumb out, backpack at her feet, looking exactly like someone who needed help. And I kept driving. Foot hard on the gas, not because I was afraid, but because some part of me remembered, some deep part that she couldn't erase. And it whispered that if I stopped again, if I picked her up a second time, I might be the one who ended up trapped in an endless loop, giving the same rides to the same ghosts, slowly forgetting which side of death I belonged to until the distinction didn't matter anymore. I've got a PhD in physics from MIT and 20 years of over-the-road experience, which means I've spent my entire adult life believing that everything has an explanation, that the universe operates on rules we can understand if we look hard enough. But what I saw at the Joplin truck stop in November of 2003 broke every rule I thought I understood about how reality works. I'm telling you this up front because I need you to know I'm not some superstitious fool who sees ghosts in every shadow or believes in UFOs because I saw a weird light in the sky. I'm a scientist who became a trucker because I got tired of academia's politics, someone who carries physics textbooks in my sleeper cab and does calculations in my head to pass the time. Someone who has spent decades explaining away the supernatural with natural causes, which is why it destroys me that I can't explain what happened that night, no matter how many times I've tried. I'd pulled into the pilot off Interstate 44 around 2 in the morning, right in the heart of what locals call the Spooksville Triangle, though I'd always dismissed that as small-town superstition designed to attract tourists and sell t-shirts to people who believe in things that don't exist. The lot was mostly empty, except for maybe 6 other rigs scattered across the parking area. And I'd chosen a spot near the back because I prefer the quiet, prefer to be away from the diesel engines and the hiss of air brakes and the conversations of drivers who can't sleep. I'd just settled into my bunk with a book on quantum mechanics, trying to wind down enough to sleep, when the first light appeared outside my window. A perfect sphere about the size of a basketball, glowing with this soft, blue-white luminescence that reminded me of Cherenkov radiation, that eerie light you see in nuclear reactors when particles move faster than light speed in water. My first thought was, someone's playing with a drone. Some kid with expensive toys and no respect for other people's sleep. But the light moved wrong. Not with the mechanical precision of a quadcopter, but with organic fluidity, drifting across the parking lot like it was swimming through the air. And it made absolutely no sound, which violated basic aerodynamics, because anything that moves through atmosphere creates friction, creates noise, creates some kind of disturbance in the air molecules around it. I sat up and watched it circle a rig 3 spots over, and I could see the light it cast was wrong too. It illuminated the truck's trailer, but didn't create shadows, just this even glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Like the light wasn't bouncing off surfaces the way light is supposed to, but was somehow occupying the same space as the objects it was illuminating. Then a second light appeared, and a third. And within 30 seconds, there were 7 of them floating through the parking lot. All perfect spheres, all the same size, all emitting that impossible light that my brain kept trying to categorize as something I understood. Ball lightning, swamp gas, some kind of bioluminescent phenomenon. But none of those explanations fit what I was observing. I grabbed my phone to record it because I knew no one would believe me without evidence. But when I looked at the screen, all I could see was static, white noise, like the lights were somehow interfering with the camera's sensors or the electromagnetic field they generated was scrambling the electronics. I put the phone down and just watched. And that's when I noticed the lights weren't moving randomly. They were searching, methodically checking each truck, hovering outside cabs, circling trailers, like they were looking for something or someone. And I felt this primal fear kick in, this awareness that I was watching something hunt. One of the lights drifted toward my truck, and I pressed myself back against the sleeper cab wall, trying to make myself small, trying to be invisible, and it stopped right outside my window, maybe 3 feet from my face. And I could see now that it wasn't just a sphere of light, but something inside the light, a shape that kept almost resolving into something recognizable, before shifting back into abstraction, like looking at one of those optical illusions where you can see either a vase or 2 faces depending on how you focus your eyes. Except this was happening in 3 dimensions, and the shifting never stopped. The light cast this glow through my window that didn't behave like normal light. It passed through some materials and reflected off others in ways that made no sense, hitting my water bottle and going straight through like the plastic wasn't there. bouncing off my cotton shirt like it was a mirror. Ignoring every principle of refraction and reflection I'd spent years studying. I realized the light was looking at me, not in the sense that it had eyes, but in the sense that it was aware of me, that there was some kind of intelligence directing its attention. And I had this overwhelming feeling that it was analyzing me, taking measurements, recording data, studying me the way I'd spent my life studying the physical world. And the irony of being on the other side of that equation wasn't lost on me even through my terror. It hovered there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. And I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stare back at this impossible thing that my education told me couldn't exist, but my eyes confirmed was absolutely real. Then it did something that I still can't adequately describe. It pulsed, and in that pulse, I felt something pass through me, through my body, through my mind, like it had reached inside me and touched something fundamental, something deeper than tissue and bone, something that might be consciousness or soul or whatever you want to call the thing that makes you you. And in that moment, I understood things I shouldn't understand. Saw patterns in the universe I'd never noticed, felt connections between quantum mechanics and consciousness that my professors would have laughed out of the room. The sensation lasted maybe half a second, but it changed something in me, rewired some circuit in my brain. And when it passed, the light drifted away, rejoining the others as they gathered in the center of the parking lot, forming a perfect geometric pattern that I recognized from my studies. A 3-dimensional Fibonacci spiral, mathematically precise, beautiful, and terrifying in its complexity. They held that formation for maybe 10 seconds, pulsing in sequence like they were communicating. And then they shot straight up into the sky faster than anything I'd ever seen, faster than should be possible without creating sonic booms or heat signatures. Just gone in an instant like they'd never been there at all. I sat in my truck for the rest of the night, too shaken to sleep, too confused to drive, trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed, trying to fit it into my understanding of physics and failing completely because everything about those lights violated fundamental laws. The way they moved suggested they had no mass, but they cast light, which requires energy, which requires mass. The way they interacted with materials suggested they existed in multiple states simultaneously. The way they communicated suggested intelligence, but not biological intelligence, something else. Something I don't have concepts or language to describe. When morning came, I got out and checked the spot where the lights had hovered, looking for evidence, for burn marks or radiation or anything that would prove I hadn't imagined it. And there was nothing. Just normal asphalt and normal dirt. Except when I looked at it from certain angles, I could see patterns in the ground, geometric shapes that were too perfect to be random, too subtle to be obvious unless you knew what you were looking for. I asked the other drivers if they'd seen anything, and most of them looked at me like I was crazy. But one old-timer just nodded and said, "The lights." Like that explained everything. Like it was so common it didn't need elaboration. And he told me they'd been appearing at this truck stop since before there was a truck stop, back when it was just a railroad crossing and a general store, that the Osage Indians who used to live in this area considered this ground sacred and dangerous, that there were stories going back hundreds of years about lights that watched and waited and sometimes took people who stayed too long. I drove out of there that morning, and I've never been back, not in 22 years. Not even though it would save me 3 hours on certain routes. Because I can't shake the feeling that those lights marked me somehow. That they know me now. That if I went back, they'd be waiting. I still do physics problems in my head while I drive. Still read textbooks and journals. Still consider myself a scientist. But I've had to expand my definition of what's possible, had to accept that maybe we don't understand the universe as well as we think we do. That maybe there are phenomena that exist in the gaps between our equations, in the spaces where quantum mechanics and general relativity break down. And maybe consciousness isn't just an emergent property of neural activity, but something that interfaces with reality in ways we haven't even begun to measure. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through darkness, I see lights in my peripheral vision, and I can never tell if they're real or if they're afterimages burned into my consciousness from that night at Joplin. But it doesn't matter anymore, because I know now that the universe is stranger and more aware than I ever imagined. And that knowledge has made me both more humble and more terrified than any equation ever could. I haven't slept properly in 6 days. And that's important because you need to understand the state I was in when the dog appeared. Exhausted beyond reason. Running on nothing but caffeine and stubbornness, pushing through Wyoming in the middle of a January blizzard because I needed the money and couldn't afford to stop. My name's irrelevant. But what matters is that I'd been chasing a bonus for on-time delivery, one of those situations where the company dangles an extra $2,000 in front of you if you can make an impossible deadline. And I'd been stupid enough to believe I could do it. Stupid enough to keep driving when every rational part of my brain screamed at me to pull over and rest. The snow had been falling for 18 hours straight, turning Interstate 80 into this narrow tunnel of visibility where the world ended 10 feet beyond my headlights, and nothing existed except white and more white, and the hypnotic rhythm of windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against accumulation. I'd started seeing things around hour 70. Shadows moving at the edge of my vision, faces in the snow patterns on my windshield, my dead father sitting in the passenger seat telling me to slow down, to stop, to rest before I killed someone. But I'd shake my head and the hallucinations would dissolve, and I'd keep driving because stopping meant failure, and failure meant poverty, and poverty meant losing everything I'd worked for. The dog appeared at mile marker 235, somewhere in the vast emptiness between Rawlins and Rock Springs, where the highway climbs through high desert plateau and the wind hits your rig like God's trying to push you off the road. It was standing in the middle of my lane, massive, bigger than any dog should be, black as the space between stars, and its eyes reflected my headlights with this intense golden glow that made my breath catch and my foot slam on the brake without conscious thought. I felt my rig start to slide on the ice, felt that horrible sensation of momentum carrying me forward while my wheels locked up and my trailer started to swing, and I fought the skid with everything I had, steering into it, pumping the brakes, praying I wouldn't jackknife or flip. And somehow, impossibly, I brought the truck to a stop maybe 20 feet from where the dog stood watching me with those burning eyes. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my temples. And I sat there in the silence after the engine shuddered to idle, staring at this creature that shouldn't exist at this altitude, in this weather, in the middle of a highway at 4 a.m. It was easily the size of a small horse, with fur so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And it stood perfectly still in my headlights. Not panting, not moving, just watching me with an intensity that felt almost human, almost intelligent, like it was waiting for something, expecting something. And I had this irrational certainty that it had appeared specifically for me, that this wasn't random or coincidental but intentional. I honked my horn, a long blast that should have sent any animal running. But it didn't move, didn't even flinch, just kept staring with those eyes that seemed to look through my windshield, through my body, into something deeper that I didn't have a name for. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me in my truck, the dog in the road, the snow falling between us like a curtain. But eventually, I realized I had two choices. Sit here until I froze or my fuel ran out, or get out and try to scare it away. And neither option felt safe, but at least the second one involved action, involved doing something instead of waiting to die. I grabbed my flashlight, the heavy metal kind you can use as a weapon if needed, and I opened my door. And the moment my boots hit the pavement, the dog moved for the first time, turning its massive head to track me. And I could see now that it wasn't just big, but wrong. Proportioned in ways that violated canine anatomy, with legs too long and a skull too broad, and shoulders that suggested something more predatory than any domestic breed. I shouted at it, waved my arms, tried to make myself look bigger and more threatening. But it just watched me. And then it did something that made my blood turn to ice. It sat down, deliberately, like a trained dog responding to a command I hadn't given. And it raised one paw and placed it on the ground in front of it. And I realized it was pointing, gesturing toward the shoulder of the road, toward the guardrail barely visible through the snow. I followed where it was pointing with my flashlight beam. And I saw the tire tracks, fresh tracks that led off the highway and through the guardrail. And I walked closer, despite every instinct screaming at me to get back in my truck, and I looked over the edge. And there was a car down there, maybe 50 feet down the embankment, upside down, its headlights still on, casting this eerie glow up through the falling snow. I called 911 on my cell. And somehow I had signal, even though I shouldn't have in this dead zone. And I told them about the accident, gave them the mile marker, and they said they'd send someone, but it might be 2 hours because the roads were so bad. And I looked back at where the dog had been, and it was gone, vanished like it had never existed. No paw prints in the snow, no sign it had been there except for my own memory of those golden eyes watching me. I should have waited in my truck, should have stayed warm and let the professionals handle it. But something pulled me down that embankment, some sense of responsibility or guilt or maybe just desperation to prove to myself I was still human, still capable of caring about someone else's life when I'd been so focused on my own deadline and my own profit. The descent was treacherous. The snow up to my knees, my boots slipping on ice hidden beneath, and I fell twice before I reached the car. And when I got there and looked inside, there was a woman, mid-30s maybe, unconscious but breathing, trapped upside down by her seatbelt, with blood running from a gash on her forehead. I couldn't get the door open. It was crushed shut. But I managed to break the window with my flashlight and reach in and check her pulse. And it was there, weak but steady. And I talked to her even though she couldn't hear me. Told her help was coming, told her to hold on, told her she was going to be okay, even though I had no way of knowing if that was true. The cold was brutal, seeping through my jacket, numbing my fingers, and I realized with growing horror that if I'd kept driving, if the dog hadn't appeared and forced me to stop, I would have passed this accident without ever knowing, would have driven past while this woman slowly froze to death in her wrecked car. And that knowledge sat in my stomach like a stone, heavy and undeniable. Emergency services arrived 90 minutes later, and they got her out with hydraulic tools and loaded her into an ambulance. And the paramedic told me I'd probably saved her life, that another hour and the cold would have killed her. And I just nodded and didn't mention the dog, because how do you explain something like that to someone who deals in facts and logic and medical procedures? They asked if I was okay to keep driving. And I lied and said yes, because what else could I say? And I climbed back up that embankment and got in my truck and sat there shaking. Not from cold, but from the weight of what had just happened. From the understanding that I'd been saved from myself. from my own exhaustion and greed and stupid belief that I was invincible. I drove to the next truck stop, maybe 10 miles down the road, and I parked and I slept for 12 hours. And when I woke up, I called my dispatcher and told him I'd missed the deadline, that I'd had to stop for an emergency. And he was angry and told me there'd be consequences, and I didn't care because I was alive. And that woman was alive. And nothing else mattered. I asked around at the truck stop about the black dog, described what I had seen. And 3 different drivers told me similar stories. Massive black dogs appearing on dangerous stretches of highway, always at night, always when drivers were exhausted or in danger, always leading them to accidents or forcing them to stop before they crashed. They called it the black dog of I-80. Said it had been appearing for decades, said some people thought it was a guardian angel. Some thought it was death itself deciding who to take and who to spare. And nobody knew which was true, but everyone agreed it was real. That too many people had seen it for it to be coincidence or hallucination. I've driven that stretch of I-80 probably 100 times since then, and I've never seen the dog again. But I've never forgotten those golden eyes watching me. Never forgotten the way it pointed toward that wrecked car. Never forgotten the feeling that something out there in the darkness was keeping score, was measuring my worth, was deciding whether I deserved to be saved or left to face the consequences of my own stupidity. I don't push myself past exhaustion anymore. Don't chase bonuses at the expense of safety. Don't drive when my body tells me to rest, because I know now that the road is full of things that watch and wait and judge. And I got my warning, got my second chance, and I'm not stupid enough to waste it. The CB radio in my truck hasn't worked in 3 years, the wiring fried by a lightning strike outside Tulsa. But that didn't stop it from speaking to me at the Pilot Travel Center in Jamestown, New Mexico. And what it said made me question everything I thought I knew about death and highways and the spaces between. I'm one of those old-school drivers who learned the trade when CB radios were lifelines. When you relied on Channel 19 to warn you about accidents and speed traps and weather ahead. When the voices crackling through the static were your only companions through the long, dark hours. And even though everyone uses cell phones now, I kept my old Cobra mounted on the dash like a relic from a better time, a memorial to the way things used to be before the world got so connected it forgot how to be human. I'd been hauling furniture from Phoenix to Amarillo, and I'd stopped at the Jamestown Pilot because it was the only fuel between Gallup and Tucumcari that didn't charge highway robbery prices, pulling in around 11 at night when the place was mostly empty. Just a few scattered rigs and the buzz of sodium lights casting everything in that orange glow that makes the desert look like Mars. I'd parked, filled up, grabbed a terrible cup of coffee from inside, and climbed back in my cab to update my logbook before catching a few hours of sleep. And that's when I heard it. Static bursting from my dead CB radio, loud and sudden, making me spill coffee on my pants and curse. And through the white noise, I heard a voice, male, gravelly, saying, "Breaker, breaker, this is Smokestack heading eastbound on 66? Anyone got their ears on?" I stared at the radio, at this piece of equipment I knew for certain was disconnected, physically incapable of receiving signals. And I reached out and touched the power knob to confirm it was in the off position. And it was. But the voice kept coming through, asking again if anyone was listening, if anyone could hear him out there in the darkness. I should have ignored it. Should have chalked it up to some weird interference, some crossed signal from a nearby rig. But something in that voice grabbed me, something desperate and lonely. And I found myself picking up the microphone I hadn't used in years and pressing the talk button and saying, "This is Roadrunner at the Jamestown Pilot. I've got you Smokestack. What's your 20? The static cleared for a moment, went almost silent, and then the voice came back stronger, clearer, and it said, "Thank Christ, I thought everyone was gone. I've been calling for hours and nobody's been answering. I'm somewhere past the Rio Puerco Bridge, but I can't see much. The dust is too thick, the storm's too bad. And I'm starting to think I'm not going to make it out of this." I told him to stay calm, that storms pass, that he should pull over and wait it out. But he said he couldn't stop, that his brakes weren't responding right, that something was wrong with his rig. And I heard fear in his voice, real terror. And I asked him what kind of truck he was driving, what company, trying to get enough information to call for help. And he said he was an independent hauler, driving a 1952 Kenworth with a load of machinery parts. And my blood went cold because there's no way anyone's driving a 1952 anything in 2014. No way a truck that old would still be on the road, still be road legal, still be capable of highway speeds. I asked him what year it was, trying to keep my voice steady. And there was a long pause filled with static. And then he said, "It's 1953, July." Why the hell would you ask me what year it is? Are you drunk or something? The coffee cup fell from my hand, and I just sat there listening to the static, listening to this man who was speaking to me from 61 years in the past. And I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if something impossible was happening through this dead radio in the middle of the New Mexico desert. He kept talking, kept describing the storm he was driving through, the way the dust was so thick it looked like brown fog, the way his steering felt loose and his brakes felt soft, the way he had this terrible feeling that something bad was about to happen. And I wanted to warn him, wanted to tell him to stop, to pull over, to do anything except keep driving. But how do you warn someone who's already dead, someone who's been dead longer than you've been alive? I asked him his name, his real name, and he said, "Walter Briggs out of Flagstaff." And I grabbed my phone and searched for that name, for any information. And I found it. A newspaper article from July 1953 about a trucker named Walter Briggs, who died when his truck went off the road during a dust storm near Jamestown, his body not found for 3 days. The accident attributed to brake failure and poor visibility. And I sat there staring at my phone screen while his voice kept coming through my dead radio, kept asking if I was still there, if I could still hear him, if someone was going to help him. I didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to explain to him that he was asking for help that was 61 years too late, that whatever happened next had already happened, that his fate was sealed in newsprint and cemetery records. And I felt this overwhelming sadness, this grief for a man I'd never met, who died before my father was born. And I picked up the microphone, and I told him, "Walter, I'm here, I'm listening, you're not alone." And he said, "Thank you. I just needed to know someone could hear me. I've been so scared out here, so alone. And I can see lights ahead now, red lights. And I think it might be help. I think I'm going to be okay." I knew those red lights weren't help. Knew they were probably taillights from another vehicle, or maybe nothing at all. Just phantom lights in the dust. And I knew that what came next was Walter Briggs losing control and going off the road and dying in the desert heat while people searched for him. But I couldn't tell him that, couldn't take away his hope, so I just said, "You're going to be okay, Walter. You're going to be just fine." And he said, "I see them now. I'm right behind them. I'm going to follow them out of this storm." And then there was a sound like metal tearing and glass breaking and a scream that cut off abruptly, and then just static, endless static. And I sat there with a microphone in my hand, crying for a man who'd been dead since 1953. The static continued for maybe another minute. And then another voice came through, female this time, younger, and she said, "Breaker, breaker. This is Nightingale looking for anyone on 66. I've got engine trouble near the Arizona border. And I recognized that voice from somewhere. From some story I'd heard. And I asked her name, and she said, Patricia Morrison out of Albuquerque. And I searched and found another article, this one from 1968. Another dead trucker, another accident on this same stretch of highway. And I realized what was happening. Realized that this dead radio was picking up the final transmissions of every trucker who died on Route 66, their last calls for help echoing through time, trapped in some eternal loop of fear and desperation. More voices came through over the next hour. Men and women, young and old, spanning decades, all calling for help that never came, all asking if anyone could hear them, all alone on dark highways in the moments before their deaths. And I listened to every one of them, answered every call, told them I was there, told them they weren't alone. Because what else could I do? What else could I offer, except the comfort of a voice in the darkness, even if that voice was coming from a future they'd never see? Some of them asked questions. What year is it? Where am I? Why can't I find the next town? And I answered as gently as I could, trying not to let them hear the grief in my voice, trying to give them peace in whatever strange space they occupied between life and death and memory. The last voice came through around 1 in the morning, and it was different from the others, calmer, more aware, and it said, "You've been kind tonight, listening to us, talking to us, making our last moments less lonely. And we want you to know it matters. It helps. It makes the darkness less dark." And I asked who was speaking. And the voice said, "All of us. Everyone who's ever died on this highway. Everyone whose last thought was that they were alone. And you've given us something we didn't have before. Connection. Proof that our voices still matter, that we're still remembered, still heard. And for that, we're grateful." I asked if they were trapped, if they were suffering, if there was anything I could do to help them move on. And the voice said, "We're not trapped, we're just echoes, recordings in the electromagnetic spectrum, impressions left in the space where we spent our final moments, and we'll fade eventually. But for now we exist, and it's better to exist and be heard than to exist in silence. So thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being human in a world that's forgotten how." The static cleared, and my radio went silent, truly silent. And I sat there in my truck at the Jamestown Pilot, watching the sun come up over the desert, watching the other drivers wake and start their engines and pull out onto highways that have claimed so many lives over so many years. And I knew I'd been given something precious. A glimpse into the spaces between, a conversation with the dead, a reminder that every voice matters, every life matters, every death leaves an echo. I got my CB radio fixed after that, had it rewired and tested and verified working, and I keep it on channel 19 now, always listening, always ready. Because sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through darkness, I hear them again. The voices of the lost, the dead, the forgotten, calling out for help or company or just someone to acknowledge they existed. And I always answer, always respond, always let them know that someone's listening, that someone cares, that they're not alone in whatever strange space they occupy. And maybe that's all any of us really want. To be heard, to be remembered, to know that our voices echo beyond our deaths into a future that will take the time to listen. I'm a woman in a business that's still 90% men, which means I've spent the last 8 years being careful, checking my locks, varying my routes, trusting my instincts, never getting comfortable. But none of that preparation mattered when I realized someone was in my sleeper cab on Interstate 95. because the thing behind my seat wasn't something you could lock out or fight off or even understand. Let me be clear about something first. I'm not the type who scares easily. Not after 8 years of dealing with aggressive truck stop drunks and creeps who think a woman driver is fair game, and dispatchers who assign the worst routes hoping I'll quit so they can hire someone with a Y chromosome. I carry pepper spray, a taser, and a tire iron within arm's reach at all times. And I've got a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that I earned specifically because I refuse to be vulnerable in a sleeper cab at a rest stop. I do everything right. I always lock my doors, always check my surroundings, always park under lights, always trust that feeling in my gut that says something's wrong. And that's why what happened scared me so deeply. Because I did everything right, and it still got in. I'd picked up a load in Miami heading to Boston, running straight through the night because the freight was time-sensitive and the pay was good. And I'd been making excellent time up I-95 through Georgia and into South Carolina when I started getting that feeling, that prickling awareness at the back of my neck that means someone's watching you. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, as the natural hypervigilance that comes from being a woman alone on dark highways. But the feeling intensified as I drove through the heavy traffic around Florence. That claustrophobic sensation of being surrounded by other trucks and cars, any one of which could contain someone with bad intentions. I checked my mirrors constantly, scanned the vehicles around me, made sure no one was following too close or pacing me. But everything seemed normal, just the usual chaos of interstate commerce. And I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination run wild because I was tired and the coffee had made me jittery. The traffic thinned out after Florence, and I settled into that zone drivers get into on long hauls, that almost meditative state where your body drives on autopilot while your mind wanders. And I was thinking about my daughter's upcoming birthday, planning what present to get her, when I caught movement in my rearview mirror. Not outside the truck, but inside, in the sleeper cab behind me. Just a flicker of shadow shifting in the darkness beyond the curtain that separated the driving area from the sleeping area. I felt my breath catch, felt that spike of adrenaline that makes everything go sharp and clear. And I reached for my tire iron while keeping my eyes on the road, because the last thing I needed was to wreck while dealing with a potential threat. I called out, "Who's there?" trying to keep my voice steady and authoritative, the voice I use when truck stop creeps get too friendly. But there was no response, just silence and the rumble of the diesel engine. And I started running through possibilities in my mind. Maybe someone had hidden in my truck while I was fueling in Miami. Maybe they'd climbed in while I was doing my pre-trip inspection. Maybe they'd been waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And I felt anger mixing with fear because this was exactly the nightmare scenario every woman driver dreads, trapped in a moving vehicle with an intruder. I needed to pull over, needed to get into a position where I could defend myself or run. But the next exit was 12 miles ahead, and the shoulder was narrow and dangerous. And I made the calculation that I was safer maintaining speed and control than stopping on the side of a highway where anything could happen. I kept glancing in the mirror, watching for more movement. And I saw it again. A shape behind the curtain, definitely human-sized, definitely there, shifting its weight in a way that made the whole cab rock slightly. And I gripped the tire iron tighter and said, "I'm armed and I'm calling the police, so you need to identify yourself right now." Still no response, and I grabbed my phone with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel, pulling up 911, ready to call. When the curtain moved, pulled aside by what should have been a hand but looked wrong in the darkness, too long, too pale. And I saw a face peek through, or what might have been a face, features obscured by shadow and distance, but definitely looking at me, definitely watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I hit dial and told the dispatcher there was an intruder in my vehicle, gave my location, my heading, my truck number, and they said they'd send state police to intercept me at the next exit. Told me to stay calm, stay on the line, don't engage with the intruder, just keep driving. And I did. I kept that truck at 70 miles per hour while my heart tried to punch through my ribs and sweat ran down my back despite the air conditioning. The shape behind the curtain didn't move forward, didn't try to attack, just kept watching me from the shadows. And I found that almost more disturbing than if it had tried something. Because at least action would have been understandable, would have fit into my framework of threats and responses. But this passive observation felt wrong, felt predatory in a way I couldn't articulate. I started talking, partly to keep the 911 dispatcher updated, but mostly to fill the silence, to assert some kind of control over the situation, saying things like, "I can see you back there. Police are on their way. You've got nowhere to go. You might as well come out." But the shape never responded, never moved forward or back, just kept that same position half hidden by the curtain. And I noticed something that made my blood run colder. I couldn't hear breathing. In the confined space of a truck cab, you can hear everything, every breath, every movement, every shift of weight. But I couldn't hear anything from the sleeper cab except silence. Like whatever was back there didn't need to breathe or was holding its breath with impossible stillness. The exit finally appeared, and I saw the flashing lights of 3 state police cruisers waiting on the ramp. And I pulled over and locked my doors and sat there shaking while officers approached with flashlights and weapons drawn. And they surrounded my truck and called for whoever was inside to come out with hands visible. And when nothing happened, they opened the passenger door and climbed in and pulled back the curtain to the sleeper cab. And I watched in my mirror as their faces went from tense readiness to confusion. Because the sleeper cab was empty, completely empty. Nothing back there except my sleeping bag and some clothes and supplies. No place anyone could hide, no sign anyone had been there. They checked everything, looked under the cab, in the storage compartments, ran a K9 unit around the entire truck, and found nothing. No one. No evidence of an intruder. And I could see in their eyes that they thought I was either lying or crazy, probably crazy. Just another hysterical woman who let her imagination run wild. And I wanted to scream at them that I saw something, that I knew what I saw. But how do you prove the presence of something that leaves no evidence, no trace, no physical proof it ever existed? They filed a report, told me I should probably get some rest, suggested maybe the stress of long-haul driving was getting to me. And they let me go. And I sat in that truck stop parking lot for 3 hours with all the lights on, staring at the curtain that separated the sleeper cab from the driver's seat, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. I didn't imagine it, though. Because 2 days later, when I was in Boston unloading, I found scratches on the inside of the sleeper cab wall. Long gouges in the fiberglass that definitely weren't there when I'd started the trip. Scratches that looked almost like claw marks or maybe fingers dragging down the surface. And I took pictures and documented everything, but who was I going to show them to? Who would believe that something had been in my truck, something that could hide from police and dogs and leave no trace except marks on the wall that could be explained away as wear and tear? I talked to other women drivers after that, asked carefully if they'd ever experienced anything similar. And 3 of them told me stories about feeling watched in their cabs, about seeing movement in their mirrors, about knowing something was there even though it shouldn't be possible. And they all said the same thing. It happens on I-95, always on I-95, somewhere in the Carolinas. And it never attacks, never hurts anyone, just watches just lets you know it's there, just violates your space and your security and leaves you questioning your own sanity. I still drive I-95 because I refuse to let fear control my routes or my career. But I never use the sleeper cab on that stretch anymore, never pull the curtain closed, keep everything visible and lit. And I've started carrying a dash cam pointed backward at the sleeping area, recording constantly. Because the next time I see something back there, I'm going to have proof, going to have evidence that I'm not crazy. That something exists in that space between the front seat and the back, something that can hide from police, but not from constant surveillance. I haven't seen it again in 6 months, but I feel it sometimes. That presence, that awareness. And I wonder what it wants. Why it targets women drivers specifically. Whether it's something supernatural or something worse. Something human that's learned how to move through spaces without being caught. And I don't know which possibility scares me more. That something impossible is watching me. Or that something very possible is getting away with terrorizing women on dark highways, and no one believes us when we report it, because we're just hysterical females who can't handle the stress of a man's job. I keep a logbook that most drivers would call obsessive, documenting every mile, every fuel stop, every minute of drive time with mathematical precision. Which is why I know with absolute certainty that I drove the same 17-mile stretch of Interstate 4 exactly 43 times in one night, and why I'll never trust my own perception of reality again. Numbers have always made sense to me in a way that people don't, which is probably why I became a trucker instead of staying in the accounting firm where everyone expected me to spend my career pushing spreadsheets and attending meetings about meetings. Out here on the road, everything is quantifiable. Miles per gallon, miles per hour, weight distribution, fuel consumption, delivery windows. And I find comfort in that predictability. In knowing that if I do the math correctly, I can predict exactly when I'll arrive and how much fuel I'll need and which rest stops I'll use based on optimal timing and efficiency. I'd been hauling electronics from Tampa to Orlando, a short run of 84 miles that should have taken 90 minutes in light traffic. And I'd left Tampa at 11:47 p.m. with a full tank and a GPS showing an arrival time of 1:18 a.m. And I remember thinking this would be an easy night, an uncomplicated straight shot up I-4 that I'd done probably 200 times before. The first sign something was wrong came at mile marker 31, right where I-4 passes through that stretch of empty land between Lakeland and Orlando, where the swamps press in from both sides and the fog rolls across the highway like something alive. I noticed the mile marker because I always notice mile markers. It's part of my system, part of how I track my progress. And I made a mental note. Mile marker 31 at 12:34 a.m., right on schedule. 10 minutes later, I passed mile marker 31 again. And I thought maybe I'd misread it the first time. Maybe I'd been thinking about something else and glanced at the wrong sign. So I paid closer attention, watched my odometer, watched the GPS, and kept driving. Mile marker 32 came up, then 33, then 34. And I relaxed because obviously I'd just confused myself, just had a momentary lapse in attention. But then I passed mile marker 31 again. And this time I was watching for it. This time there was no doubt. And I felt this cold certainty settle in my chest that something impossible was happening. I checked my GPS, and it showed me progressing normally up I-4, the little blue dot moving steadily north toward Orlando, gaining mileage, following the route exactly as programmed. But my eyes were telling me I was passing the same exits, the same signs, the same oddly shaped dead tree on the right shoulder that I'd noticed 3 times now. I started documenting everything in my voice recorder, time-stamping each observation. 12:51 a.m., passing mile marker 31 for the 3rd time. GPS shows mile marker 39, Odometer shows I've traveled 23 miles since Tampa. But I keep returning to the same physical location. I tried taking different lanes, tried varying my speed, tried following other vehicles. But there were no other vehicles. Just me and the empty highway, and the fog that seemed to get thicker each time I completed what I was starting to think of as the loop. The fourth time I passed mile marker 31, I pulled over, physically stopped my truck on the shoulder, and got out to touch the sign, to confirm it was real, to prove to myself I wasn't hallucinating. And the metal was cold and solid under my fingers, and the numbers were clear 31. And I stood there in the humid Florida night, listening to frogs and insects, and trying to understand what was happening. I got back in my truck and called my dispatcher, but the call wouldn't connect. Just went straight to a recording saying the number was unavailable. And I tried 911 and got the same result. Tried my wife and my daughter and my mother and everyone in my contacts. And every single call failed. Like my phone worked perfectly except for the part where it could actually connect to another human being. The GPS still showed me on I-4, still showed Orlando ahead, still calculated arrival times and distances. But I knew now that it was lying. Or maybe it was telling the truth and physical reality was lying. And I didn't know which possibility scared me more. I drove the loop 7 more times, counting, documenting, trying different approaches, faster, slower, with headlights off, with hazards on, staying in the right lane, staying in the left lane. And nothing changed. Nothing broke the pattern. Just the same 17 miles from marker 31 to marker 47. And then somehow back to marker 31. Like the highway had bent into a circle. Or like space itself was folded in on itself in ways that violated every law of physics. I started noticing details I'd missed before. The same car abandoned on the shoulder with its hazards still blinking, the same mile marker signs showing where in identical patterns, the same section of guardrail that was slightly bent. And I realized these weren't similar things. They were the exact same things. I was literally traveling through the same space repeatedly, like a DVD skipping, like a video game glitch. Like reality had gotten stuck in a loop and I was trapped inside it. Around the 15th repetition, I saw another truck, the first other vehicle I'd encountered since entering the loop. And I accelerated to catch up to it. Flashing my lights, honking my horn, desperate for contact, for confirmation I wasn't alone. But as I got closer, I realized I recognized that truck. Recognized the company logo and the license plate and the specific pattern of running lights. And with horror, I understood I was looking at my own truck, at myself, at some echo or replay of my passage through this space. I watched myself drive for maybe 30 seconds. Watched my own tail lights navigate the curves I'd memorized, and then I blinked and the truck was gone, vanished, and I was alone again with the fog and the highway, and the growing certainty that I'd driven into something I didn't have words for, some anomaly or pocket dimension or fold in space-time where normal rules didn't apply. I started doing the math, calculating probabilities and possibilities, trying to apply logic to something fundamentally illogical. And I figured that if I was truly trapped in a loop, eventually something would have to change, eventually the loop would break, or I'd run out of fuel, or morning would come and reset whatever conditions were causing this. So I kept driving, kept documenting, kept marking each repetition in my logbook with precise timestamps and observations. The fog got thicker with each loop, reducing visibility from hundreds of feet to dozens to eventually just the immediate area around my truck. And I had this terrifying thought that maybe the fog wasn't weather. Maybe it was reality itself breaking down, the edges of the loop fraying. And if I drove too far into it, I might fall through into something worse. Something that wasn't even a highway anymore. By the 30th repetition, I was starting to lose my grip on time, starting to question how long I'd really been driving, because my watch said it had been 3 hours, but it felt like days. Felt like I'd been trapped in this loop for so long that my previous life was just a memory. Just a dream of a world where highways went places and time moved forward and reality made sense. I tried to remember my wife's face, my daughter's voice, the layout of my house, and the details were fuzzy, indistinct, like they were fading the longer I stayed in the loop. And I wondered if that's what happened to people who got trapped here. They just slowly forgot who they were until they became part of the loop itself. Eternal drivers on an eternal highway, going nowhere forever. The 37th time I passed mile marker 31, something was different. There was a figure standing on the shoulder, human-shaped but wrong somehow. And as I approached, I could see it was holding a sign, and the sign said, "Stop." But I was too afraid to stop, because what if stopping meant being stuck forever? What if the only thing keeping me semi-sane was the motion, the act of driving, the illusion that I was going somewhere, even though I knew I wasn't? I passed the figure and watched in my mirror as it turned to watch me go. And I saw that it wasn't holding a sign. It was a sign, like its body had been flattened and mounted on a post, like it had become part of the highway infrastructure. And I understood that's what would happen to me if I stopped. I'd become another warning sign for the next driver who got trapped in this impossible loop. I made a decision on the 40th repetition, a desperate calculation based on nothing but hope and fear. I would try to exit the loop, not by doing something different, but by doing nothing different. By simply refusing to believe in the loop. By driving with absolute certainty that I was making progress, even though all evidence suggested otherwise. I fixed my eyes on the road ahead, ignored the mile markers, ignored the GPS, ignored everything except the act of driving forward with complete faith that forward still existed, that the highway still went somewhere, that reality would reassert itself if I just believed hard enough. And I know that sounds insane. But sanity is what got me trapped, so maybe insanity was the way out. I drove through 41st, 42nd, 43rd repetitions, with my eyes straight ahead, refusing to count, refusing to document, refusing to acknowledge the loop. And somewhere around what should have been the 44th time, passing mile marker 31, the fog lifted suddenly, completely, like a curtain being pulled back, and I saw mile marker 48, then 49, then 50, and the GPS recalculated and showed Orlando ahead. And I started crying, actually crying, because I was moving forward again, because space was working correctly again, because I'd somehow broken free or been released, or maybe just gotten lucky. I pulled into the delivery facility at 6:23 a.m., 5 hours late. And when they asked what took so long, I told them traffic. Because how do you explain to someone that you got trapped in a temporal loop on a highway that's supposed to be one of the most traveled roads in Florida? I checked my fuel gauge and my odometer, did the math, and the numbers didn't make sense. I should have run out of fuel hours ago, should have driven over 400 miles based on the odometer reading, but I'd only traveled 84 miles, and my fuel level was exactly where it should be for an 84-mile trip. Like the loop hadn't consumed fuel or accumulated mileage. Like those hours had happened outside of normal reality. I still drive I-4 sometimes because it's unavoidable in my job. But I only drive it during daylight now, never at night, never in fog. And I keep my logbook precise as ever, documenting everything. Because if it happens again, I want evidence, want proof. Want something to show that I'm not crazy, that highways can trap you, that there are places where the math stops working and all your careful calculations mean nothing against something that breaks every rule you thought you understood. I pray before every trip, have done so for 32 years since the day I dedicated my life to Christ. And I believed with absolute certainty that faith was armor against evil, that God protected those who called on His name. But what happened at that rest stop near Waverly made me understand that some evils are older than my faith. And some prayers go unanswered in places where darkness has claimed dominion. I'd been hauling lumber from Charleston to Columbus, running late because of construction delays, and I'd pushed through dinner to make up time. But around 9 p.m., the fatigue hit me hard enough that I knew continuing would be dangerous, would be tempting fate and disrespecting the gift of life God had given me. So I pulled into a rest area off Route 2 near Waverly, one of those old facilities that West Virginia maintains, but barely. Just a parking lot and some picnic tables and restrooms that probably hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. There were no other vehicles when I pulled in, which wasn't unusual for a Wednesday night in October. And I did my routine. Locked my doors, checked my surroundings, said my evening prayers thanking God for safe travels and asking for protection through the night. Then settled into my sleeping bag with my Bible and a flashlight, reading Psalms like I do every night because the words bring me peace in a world that often feels hostile and chaotic. I must have fallen asleep around 10 because I remember checking my watch and thinking I'd get a solid 6 hours before my alarm. But I woke to silence. That absolute silence that's wrong somehow. That absence of normal night sounds like crickets or wind or distant traffic. And I had that immediate awareness that something had changed, that the space around my truck was different than when I'd closed my eyes. I looked out my window and my heart stopped. Actually stopped for a beat because there were people surrounding my truck, maybe 30 or 40 of them, standing in a loose circle about 20 feet out, all facing my vehicle, all perfectly still. And the light from the rest area lamps cast their shadows long across the pavement, but somehow didn't illuminate their faces. Like the darkness around their heads was thicker than normal darkness, more resistant to light. I grabbed my phone and it was dead despite being fully charged when I went to sleep. And I tried my CB radio and got nothing but static. And I felt panic rising in my chest because I was trapped, surrounded, cut off from help. And I did what I always do when fear threatens to overwhelm me. I prayed, whispered the Lord's Prayer under my breath while watching these figures stand motionless in the darkness. They were dressed strangely, I noticed. Not modern clothes, but something older, simpler, like homespun fabric and simple cuts that reminded me of photographs from Appalachian communities 100 years ago. And they all seemed to be holding something. Objects I couldn't quite make out in the shadows. And the longer I watched them, the more certain I became that they were waiting for something, expecting something. Like my arrival had been anticipated, and they'd been summoned to witness whatever came next. One of them moved, broke from the circle, and walked closer to my truck. And I could see it was a woman, elderly, with long gray hair hanging loose, and eyes that reflected my truck's running lights with an amber glow that reminded me of animal eyes in headlights. And she raised one hand and placed it flat against my driver's side window. And where her palm touched the glass frost spread outward in patterns that looked deliberate, looked like symbols or letters in some alphabet I didn't recognize. She spoke, and I heard her clearly despite the closed window, despite the diesel engine idling, heard her like she was sitting next to me. And she said, "You've parked in the circle, and the circle demands participation. So you'll stand with us, or you'll feed what we're feeding. And either way, you're part of the ceremony now." I told her I was a Christian, that I was protected by the blood of Christ, that whatever evil she served had no power over me. And she smiled with too many teeth and said, The old powers don't care what names you use, don't care what stories you tell yourself. They existed before your God, and they'll exist after. And this ground has been theirs for 10,000 years, consecrated with blood and faith older than your Bible. And you're not the first believer to park here, and you won't be the last to learn that some places belong to forces that predate salvation. I felt my faith waver, felt doubt creep in like cold water. And I hated myself for that weakness, prayed harder, recited scripture louder, held my Bible like a shield against whatever dark power had claimed these people. But the woman just watched me with those terrible eyes and tapped her finger against the frost symbols on my window. The circle of figures began to move, not walking, but swaying, rocking back and forth in unison like trees in wind. And they started making sounds. Not quite singing, but not quite chanting either. Something between the two that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Syllables that seemed to come from languages that predated language. From throats that maybe weren't entirely human anymore. I looked past them into the darkness beyond the rest area lights, and I saw why they'd gathered. Saw what they were summoning or containing or worshiping. There was something in the woods, something massive that moved between the trees, something that bent space around itself so that looking at it directly was impossible. Your eyes just slid off it like trying to focus on a blind spot. But you could see its effects, see branches bending under invisible weight, see the ground depressing where nothing visible stood, see reality warping around an absence that was somehow more terrifying than any presence could be. The figures raised, their arms in unison, still holding those objects I couldn't identify. And they threw them toward the darkness, toward that impossible thing in the woods. And I heard sounds like meat hitting stone, like organic matter being consumed. And the temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on the inside of my windows, on my breath, on my eyelashes. And I realized with horror that they were making an offering. We're feeding something that existed in the spaces between what we can see and what we can comprehend. And the old woman had said I'd either participate or become the offering. And I understood now that they wanted me to get out, wanted me to join their circle, wanted me to throw my own sacrifice to that thing in the darkness. I refused, kept praying, kept clutching my Bible, kept believing that faith would protect me even as the truck started rocking, started moving like something was pushing it from outside, even though I could see all the figures were still standing in their circle, still swaying and chanting, still focused on the thing in the woods. The rocking got worse, became violent, and I was thrown against the door, against the dashboard, and I heard metal groaning and glass cracking. And I screamed prayers over the sound of my truck being torn apart, screamed for God to save me, to prove His power over this ancient darkness, to show that faith meant something in the face of evil that didn't recognize Christian authority. And then it stopped. Everything stopped. The rocking ceased and the chanting ended and the cold vanished. And I opened my eyes and the sun was up and I was parked in an empty rest area with no sign of the people, no sign of the ceremony, no evidence anything had happened except that my truck was covered in scratches, deep gouges in the paint, and the doors that formed patterns that looked almost like writing, almost like warnings. And every window had those same frost symbols etched into the glass, permanent marks that wouldn't wash off or scrape away. I tried to start my truck, and it wouldn't turn over. The engine completely dead despite being mechanically sound when I'd parked. And I had to call for a tow, had to explain to a mechanic that I didn't know what had happened, that I'd just woken up to find my vehicle damaged and inoperable. The mechanic, a local guy in his 60s, looked at the scratches and the symbols and asked me where I'd parked. And when I told him the rest area near Waverly, he went pale and said, "Jesus Christ, nobody parks there. Everybody around here knows that's where the old believers gather. Been gathering there since before this was West Virginia. Since before it was Virginia. Since before white people came and renamed everything and pretended the old ways didn't exist. He told me the land around Waverly had been sacred to the people who lived here thousands of years ago. That they'd worshipped things that existed before humanity. Things that lived in the deep places and the dark places and demanded regular offerings to keep them contained. And when the tribes disappeared, their rituals were adopted by settlers who understood that some practices are necessary regardless of what you call the forces you're appeasing. And those practices had continued unbroken for centuries, passed down through families who knew that faith in new gods didn't erase the reality of old ones. He fixed my truck, charged me nothing because he said I'd paid enough already. And he told me to never go back to that rest area, never stop there again, because the old believers remember faces, remember scents, remember souls. And if you refuse to participate once, they'll make sure you participate next time, willing or not. I drove away from Waverly, and I've never been back. But I carry the marks of that night, the scars on my truck that I can't afford to repair, the symbols in my windows that remind me every day that my faith didn't protect me, that my prayers weren't answered, or maybe were answered in ways I didn't understand, that there are things in this world older and darker than the religion I've built my life around. I still pray before every trip, still read my Bible every night. But now I also research my roots, check local histories, avoid places with certain reputations, because I learned the hard way that spiritual warfare isn't metaphorical, that evil isn't just human wickedness, but actual forces that exist in specific locations and demand respect or extract consequences. And my faith wasn't armor, it was just hope. And hope isn't always enough when you park in circles that were drawn before Christ walked the earth and will be honored long after his churches have crumbled to dust. I've kept detailed driving logs since my first day behind the wheel, documenting every mile, every stop, every gallon of fuel, every anomaly. Which is why the 4 hours and 17 minutes I can't account for on Interstate 26 terrifies me more than any ghost story or urban legend ever could, because my entire life is built on documentation and verification. And there's a hole in my timeline that I can't explain, no matter how hard I try to reconstruct what happened. I'm the kind of person who triple checks everything, who backs up my logs both digitally and on paper, who installed a dash cam specifically to have objective verification of my routes and driving behavior, who measures fuel consumption against distance traveled to ensure my truck's running efficiently, who basically lives my life like I'm always preparing for an audit or an investigation. And people tell me I'm paranoid, but I prefer to think of it as thorough, as professional, as responsible. I'd picked up a load of textiles in Charleston heading to Asheville, departing at 11:43 p.m. according to my logbook. I always note exact times, not approximations. And I remember the route clearly because I-26 through South Carolina is one I've driven probably 300 times. A straightforward northwest route that takes you from the coast up into the mountains. Nothing complicated, nothing unusual. Just highway driving through mostly rural areas with scattered small towns. The last clear memory I have is passing the exit for Orangeburg at 12:31 a.m., noting it in my voice recorder like I always do, time-stamping my progress so I can calculate average speed and arrival projections. And I remember thinking the spring thunderstorm that had been threatening all evening was finally breaking. Rain starting to hit my windshield in those big heavy drops that precede a downpour. The next memory I have is pulling into a truck stop outside Spartanburg at 4:48 a.m. And between those 2 points, between Orangeburg and Spartanburg, there's nothing. Just a void where 4 hours and 17 minutes of my life should be. And when I realized that gap existed, when I checked my dash cam and saw nothing but static for that entire period, I felt something break inside me, some fundamental trust in my own perception of reality. I sat in that truck stop parking lot for 2 hours, going through everything, trying to find some rational explanation, checking my phone for any calls or texts I might have made during the missing time, checking my fuel level against distance traveled, checking my logbook for any notes I might have made, and nothing added up. Nothing made sense. According to my GPS history, I'd traveled the route normally, made steady progress from Charleston to Spartanburg. But I have zero memory of driving that distance. Zero memory of the 150 miles between my last clear moment and my next clear moment. My fuel consumption was off too. I should have used approximately 40 gallons, based on the distance traveled, but I'd used 13 gallons more than the math suggested, like I'd driven an extra 130 miles somewhere. But the GPS showed a straight route with no deviations. I called my wife, woke her up at 7 in the morning, and tried to explain what was happening. And I could hear in her voice that she thought I'd just fallen asleep, just experienced normal highway hypnosis where you zone out and lose track of time. But I've never had that happen in 26 years of driving. And even if I had, it wouldn't explain the fuel consumption discrepancy or the dash cam static, or the other things I was starting to notice as I examined my truck more carefully in the morning light. There were marks on my driver's side door, faint impressions in the paint that looked almost like handprints, but larger, with fingers too long and positioned wrong. And the door handle had this strange residue on it, something that looked organic, maybe biological, that left a film on my fingers when I touched it, that smelled like ozone and copper, and something else I couldn't identify. I drove to my delivery point in Asheville, mechanically going through the motions, and I kept trying to force the memories. Kept replaying that last moment before the gap, passing Orangeburg in the rain, trying to extend the memory forward, trying to fill in what came next. But there was nothing there, just blank space. And the more I pushed, the more I got this feeling like something was pushing back. Like there was a reason I couldn't remember, and maybe it was better that way. I delivered my load, collected my paperwork, and instead of taking my next assignment, I drove back down I-26, retracing my route in daylight, looking for anything that might trigger a memory, any landmark or exit or stretch of road that would make me remember what happened during those missing hours. Around mile marker 87, right where the highway cuts through rural Newberry County, I felt something, a sensation like déjà vu but stronger, more physical, like my body remembered being in this place even though my mind didn't. And I pulled over onto the shoulder and got out and looked around. It was just highway, nothing special. Farmland on both sides, woods in the distance. But something about this spot felt significant, felt wrong. And I walked along the shoulder looking for I don't know what. Evidence, clues, anything that might explain what happened here. I found tire tracks in the soft earth, tracks that matched my truck's tires, leading from the highway onto the shoulder and then just stopping, like I'd pulled over here for some reason, stayed for some amount of time, and then returned to the road. And that scared me because why would I pull over and not remember it, not document it, not have any record of stopping? I checked my phone's location history, and it confirmed I'd been at this spot. Showed a cluster of location pings, all from the same coordinates, spanning approximately 2 hours between 1:15 a.m. and 3:22 a.m., 2 hours where I was stationary at this random spot on a South Carolina highway for no reason I could recall. I looked at my truck more carefully and found more anomalies. The sleeper cab curtain was arranged differently than I always arrange it. My logbook was in a different position on the passenger seat. My coffee thermos was in the cup holder instead of in the side compartment where I always keep it. Like someone had gone through my truck, had touched my things, had rearranged my space while I was doing what? Standing outside? Sitting in the cab in some kind of fugue state? I didn't know, and that not knowing was driving me crazy. I started researching I-26 in South Carolina, looking for any history of accidents or phenomena or anything that might explain missing time. And I found reports, dozens of them going back years, drivers who'd experienced similar gaps, similar memory losses, always in the same general area around Newberry County, always involving several hours of missing time and fuel consumption discrepancies and dash cam malfunctions. One report from a driver named Mitchell described finding marks on his arms after a memory gap, perfectly circular bruises arranged in patterns he couldn't explain. And he'd gone to a doctor who couldn't explain them either, just documented them and suggested maybe he'd been injured during the lost time but couldn't remember the trauma. Another report from a driver named Sarah described finding dirt under her fingernails and on her boots after a memory gap, like she'd been walking in fields or woods despite having no memory of leaving her truck. I examined my own body more carefully and found things I'd missed initially. A small puncture mark on my inner elbow, like someone had drawn blood. So faint I dismissed it as an old mosquito bite. But looking at it now, I could see it was too precise, too clean, too much like a medical needle stick. My boots had mud on them, dried mud that I'd tracked into my truck, mud that shouldn't be there because I hadn't walked anywhere muddy, or at least I couldn't remember walking anywhere muddy. And that qualifier, I couldn't remember, was becoming the defining phrase of my investigation, the admission that my memory was unreliable, that I couldn't trust my own brain to tell me what I'd done or where I'd been. I became obsessed with filling in the gap, spent weeks researching, cross-referencing, trying to find patterns in the reports of other drivers, and I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The memory gaps always occurred during thunderstorms, always in spring or early summer, always in the same stretch of highway, and always involved even numbers of hours, like 2 hours or 4 hours or 6 hours, never odd intervals, never random durations, suggesting something deliberate, something controlled, something that was selecting specific drivers at specific times for specific durations. I filed a report with the South Carolina Highway Patrol, tried to explain what I'd experienced and what I'd discovered. And they took my statement and clearly thought I was either crazy or covering for falling asleep at the wheel. And I left that police station feeling more alone than I'd ever felt. Because how do you make people believe you when you can't even trust your own memories? I installed additional dash cams, multiple angles, battery backups, started recording everything continuously with timestamps that uploaded to cloud storage in real time, so no one could erase or corrupt the footage. And I kept driving I-26, kept looking for answers, kept hoping I'd experience another gap so I could document it better, capture it with my redundant systems, prove that something was happening beyond my control or understanding. 3 months later, it happened again. Same stretch of highway, same thunderstorm conditions. And this time, I woke from the gap, because that's what it feels like, waking like you've been unconscious. With my truck parked on the shoulder and all 4 of my dash cams showing static for 6 hours and 12 minutes, despite being on independent power sources and having no mechanical reason to fail simultaneously. But this time, I had something new. My phone had been recording audio the entire time, something I'd set up as a backup system. And when I listened to the recording, I heard things that I still can't explain, that I wish I'd never heard. For the first hour, there's just normal driving sounds, my breathing, the engine, the rain. And then suddenly my voice saying, "I'll pull over," except I don't remember saying that. Don't remember deciding to pull over. and then silence for approximately 20 minutes, followed by sounds that might be my door opening, footsteps on gravel. Then nothing for 4 hours. Just ambient noise that doesn't sound like inside a truck or outside a truck, but somewhere else. Somewhere that has different acoustics, different air pressure. Somewhere that makes recording equipment pick up frequencies that sound wrong, that sound like they're coming from machinery that doesn't exist or communication in languages that aren't human. Then, near the end of the recording, my voice again, saying, "I understand," and "I won't remember this," and "Thank you for the explanation." And I'm speaking to someone, but there are no other voices on the recording, just my responses to unheard questions, my agreements to unheard terms. And then footsteps again, my door closing, the engine starting, and me beginning to drive. And my voice saying into the silence, "I need to document this. I need to remember." But of course, I didn't remember. Couldn't remember. And listening to myself say those words while having no memory of saying them or what prompted them is the most disturbing thing I've ever experienced. Because it means something happened. Something significant enough that I tried to force myself to remember even while apparently agreeing not to remember. I still drive I-26, still keep my documentation obsessive and redundant. But I've accepted that there are experiences my mind can't retain. That something is taking time from me for purposes I can't understand. And the analytical part of me that needs answers has had to learn to live with questions that may never be resolved. And that loss of certainty, that acknowledgement that reality contains gaps my careful systems can't bridge, has changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I'm still new to this, still learning the roots and the rhythms of long-haul trucking, which is probably why I didn't immediately realize something was wrong when I pulled into the Silver Star truck stop on Highway 50 in Nevada, because everything looked normal, looked exactly like what a truck stop should look like. And I had no reason to doubt what my eyes were showing me until it was too late to matter. This was only my third solo cross-country run. My first time handling a route completely alone without my trainer riding shotgun to catch my mistakes and offer advice. And I was nervous about everything. About missing exits. About running out of fuel. About making wrong turns. About all the 1,000 ways a rookie driver can screw up and cost the company money or damage their rig or end up stranded in the middle of nowhere. I'd left Salt Lake City heading to Reno with a load of restaurant equipment, planning to run through the night because Highway 50 across Nevada is desolate during the day and somehow feels safer in darkness when you can't see just how empty and vast the landscape really is. Around 4 in the morning, somewhere in the middle of that stretch they call the loneliest road in America, I realized I'd miscalculated my fuel stops, that I was running lower than I should be, and I started watching for any kind of services, any place I could refuel before I ended up walking for help in the Nevada winter. The Silver Star appeared like an answer to prayer. Lights blazing in the pre-dawn darkness, a full-service truck stop with fuel pumps and a convenience store, and even a small diner. And I pulled in feeling relieved and slightly stupid for not planning better, for making exactly the kind of rookie mistake that separates professionals from amateurs. There were 3 other trucks in the lot when I arrived, their running lights on, drivers presumably sleeping or filling out logbooks. And I parked near the fuel island and went inside to prepay for diesel. And the place seemed completely normal. Fluorescent lights humming, country music playing on a radio behind the counter, the smell of coffee and fried food. A display of trucker supplies by the door, everything exactly as it should be. The clerk was an older woman, maybe 60, wearing a Silver Star uniform shirt and reading a paperback novel. And she looked up when I entered and smiled and asked how much fuel I needed. And I told her 80 gallons and handed her my company card. And she ran it through an old-style card imprinter one of those manual devices that makes carbon copies. And I remember thinking that was unusual, but not impossible. That maybe they had problems with their electronic systems, that remote locations sometimes run on older technology. She asked if I wanted anything from the diner, said they had fresh biscuits and gravy, and I was hungry enough that I said yes. And she called through a window to the kitchen and told someone named Earl to make up a breakfast plate. And I heard a male voice respond affirmatively. And everything was so normal, so mundane, so exactly what you'd expect from a Nevada truck stop that I had no reason to question any of it. I went back out to fuel my truck, and the pumps worked fine. The diesel flowing at normal pressure, the counter clicking off gallons and dollars. And I stood there in the cold December air, watching the sun start to brighten the eastern horizon and thinking about how I was going to finish this run without any more rookie mistakes. How I was going to prove to my dispatcher that I could handle solo assignments. When the pump clicked off, I topped off the tank, went back inside, and the clerk had my receipt ready along with a takeout container of food. And she wished me safe travels, and I thanked her and left. And I ate the breakfast in my truck before pulling back onto Highway 50. And it was good. Simple diner food that tasted exactly like you'd expect. And I remember thinking I'd have to remember this place for future runs. That it was a good spot to know about on this desolate stretch of highway. I made my delivery in Reno without incident, slept for 10 hours in a motel, and picked up my next assignment heading back east. And it wasn't until I was doing my expense report 3 days later that things started to unravel. I was organizing my receipts, documenting fuel purchases for the company accountant, and I pulled out the receipt from the Silver Star. And something about it looked off. The paper was yellowed, not white like a new receipt should be, and the ink was faded. And the date stamp at the top said December 7th, 2008, which made no sense because it was currently December 2024. And I'd gotten this receipt 3 days ago, not 16 years ago. I thought maybe the clerk had used old receipt paper. Maybe they'd had a box of outdated forms lying around and grabbed the wrong one. But that didn't explain why the paper looked genuinely old. Actually aged, not just printed on old stock, but weathered and yellowed like it had been sitting in a drawer for years. I looked at the receipt more carefully and noticed other details. The price per gallon was wrong, way too low. Prices from 15 or 16 years ago. And the credit card number was partially visible in the carbon impression. And I checked it against my current card, and the numbers didn't match, weren't even close, like the receipt was from a completely different transaction, a completely different time. I felt this cold sensation in my stomach, this awareness that something was very wrong. And I pulled up Google Maps on my phone and searched for Silver Star truck stop on Highway 50 in Nevada. And there was nothing, no listing, no business by that name anywhere on that route. And I thought maybe I'd remembered the name wrong. So I searched for any truck stops between Ely and Austin. And the only ones that came up were both over 60 miles from where I'd stopped, both way too far to match my memory or my fuel calculations. I started searching more frantically, looking for any mention of Silver Star. And I finally found it in a Nevada Historical Society archive. There had been a Silver Star truck stop on Highway 50, exactly where I remembered stopping. But it had closed in 2009, following a kitchen fire that killed the owner, a man named Earl Patterson, and the property had been demolished in 2010. And satellite images from 2011 showed nothing but an empty lot where the building had stood. I pulled up current satellite images and zoomed in on the location, and there was nothing there. Just scrub brush and desert. No buildings, no fuel pumps, no sign that anything had ever existed at that spot. and I felt reality starting to slip sideways, felt my certainty about what I'd experienced begin to crack and crumble. I drove back to that location 2 weeks later, took a special assignment just so I'd have an excuse to travel Highway 50. And I went there in daylight, navigated to the exact coordinates where I remembered stopping, and it was exactly as the satellite images showed. Empty desert, no structures, no pavement, no evidence of any truck stop. Nothing except dust and sagebrush and the absolute certainty that I had been here. That I had fueled my truck here. That I had paid a woman and received food from a man named Earl who died 15 years ago in a fire. I got out and walked the area, looking for any trace, any foundation, any piece of evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. And I found something. Buried in the dirt, a small metal sign, rusted and corroded, that said Silver Star Truck Stop in faded letters. And I pulled it out of the ground and held it and felt this overwhelming confusion because this sign was real, was physical, was proof that the place had existed. But it was also ancient, weathered by years of exposure, not something from an operating business. I checked my truck's fuel gauge and ran the calculations again, and the numbers didn't lie. I had fueled up somewhere, had added approximately 80 gallons of diesel because my fuel level matched what it should be if I'd filled up when I remembered filling up. But where had that fuel come from if the station didn't exist? I pulled out the receipt again, looked at it in the Nevada sunlight, and I could see now that it was definitely old. Definitely from 2008, the paper quality and printing style consistent with that era. And I read the clerk's handwritten note at the bottom that I'd somehow missed before. Safe travels, honey. Hope you find your way home. And something about that message, about the word home specifically, made me feel like I'd been given a gift or a warning or maybe both. I asked other drivers about Highway 50, about strange experiences, about anything unusual they'd encountered on that route. And 2 of them told me about the ghost stops, about places that appear to drivers who need them, who are running low on fuel or dangerously tired. Places that seem completely real until you try to find them again or talk to other people about them. One driver said he'd stopped at a diner called the Wayfarer that served him the best pie he'd ever eaten. And when he went back with his wife to show her the place, it had been closed for 20 years, boarded up and abandoned. But he still had the coffee mug he'd stolen from the table. Still had that physical evidence that he'd been somewhere, even if that somewhere didn't technically exist anymore. Another driver said these places were echoes, impressions left by businesses and people who'd served travelers with such dedication that their service continued even after death. That the land remembered kindness and replayed it for those who needed it most. I still have the receipt. Keep it in my logbook as a reminder that reality is more complicated than we like to believe. That there are places and moments that exist outside normal time, that sometimes when we need help, the universe provides it in ways that don't make logical sense, but are no less real for their impossibility. I've driven Highway 50 probably 50 times since then. Always watching for the Silver Star, always hoping to see those lights in the darkness. But it hasn't appeared again. And maybe it won't. Maybe it only appears once per person, or maybe only when the need is genuine and the driver is truly in trouble. I'm not a rookie anymore. Learned the routes and the rhythms, became the kind of driver who plans fuel stops correctly and doesn't make amateur mistakes. But I hope somewhere out there on America's loneliest roads, there are still places like the Silver Star, still echoes of kindness that reach across time to help travelers who need it. And I'm grateful I experienced it, even if I'll never fully understand it. If these 11 stories have left you staring at your screen, wondering what really happens on America's darkest roads, if you're checking over your shoulder, imagining what might be watching from the shadows, then you understand why these highways have claimed so much more than lives. They've claimed certainty, claimed sanity, claimed our comfortable belief that the world operates according to rules we understand. These are the roads where reality breaks down, where the impossible becomes undeniable. And every driver who's spent enough time out here has at least one story they can't explain, one encounter that changed them. If you want more stories like these, more encounters that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the darkness beyond your headlights, make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears, because the roads are long and the night is deep, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.